It was supposed to be the grandest night of the year, a party so dazzling that even the chandeliers seemed to compete with the diamonds on display. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, and music soared through the hall as if the entire world existed only to celebrate them. To everyone else, it was a night of triumph. To me, it was the night my own daughter called me a fat pig. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, my dress simple, my figure the subject of whispers I pretended not to hear. I had grown used to their glances, the smirks that followed me like shadows, but nothing could have prepared me for what she said. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, spoke the words loud enough for the laughter to spread. In that moment, the glittering chandeliers above felt like spotlights exposing my shame. Yet what none of them knew, what even she had chosen to forget, was that behind my silence lay a truth greater than any jewel in that room. They saw me as an embarrassment, someone to mock, someone beneath them. But by the end of that night, the very people who laughed would sit in stunned silence, and the daughter who had ridiculed me would wish she had held her tongue. Because while they judged me by my body and my dress, I held a secret none of them expected. I was the millionaire in the room. Before that night, before the word pig left my daughter's lips, there was a story she seemed to have forgotten. A story of sacrifice, of choices made in silence, of a mother who carried more than her share so her child could stand in glittering rooms like this one. I raised her alone after her father passed when she was still young. I worked days in an office that paid little and nights balancing ledgers for small businesses. While others bought new clothes or took holidays, I saved every spare coin. She went to good schools, wore uniforms crisp and spotless, and had books and tutors when she needed them. If I wore the same dress to more than one family event, it was because I had chosen her future over my vanity. In those years, I told myself it was worth it. Every insult from relatives who whispered about my weight or my lack of style became fuel. They could laugh, but they could not take away the determination I carried. I wanted my daughter to live without limits, without shame, without the fear of poverty that had haunted me. But as she grew older, I began to see a distance forming. She loved me, I knew, but she also wanted to belong to a world I had never cared to chase. A world of polished nails, sparkling gowns, and carefully measured words. When she married into wealth, I thought perhaps she would remember who had carried her to that place. Instead, I became her burden, the reminder of the past she wanted to bury. That night at the party, I saw it clearly in her smile as she leaned into her new family. She wanted them to see her as one of them, sophisticated, refined, untouched by hardship. And in her mind, I was the proof that she wasn't. I was the mother who worked too hard, ate too simply, looked too ordinary. She forgot that ordinary is what had made her extraordinary. What bound us was blood and years of sacrifice. But what divided us was pride, and it would take only one cruel moment for that bond to snap under the weight of her ambition. The party reached its peak as the orchestra swelled and champagne flowed like water. Guests moved between tables, their laughter sharp as crystal, their voices weaving a tapestry of gossip and admiration. My daughter sat with her new in-laws, radiant in her sequined gown, her smile dazzling enough to win their praise. I stayed at her table, quiet, invisible, until the moment she decided to make me the evening's entertainment. It began with a simple comment about the food. I had taken a small bite of dessert, savoring the sweetness, when she leaned close enough for the whole table to hear. "Mother," she said in a voice coated with sugar, "perhaps you should slow down. People will start thinking you eat like a fat pig." The words hit me like ice water, cutting through the music, sharper than the laughter that immediately followed. Her friends giggled into their glasses. One cousin choked on his drink from laughing too hard. Even her father-in-law smirked, nodding as though her cruelty were honesty. I froze, fork still in my hand, every eye suddenly fixed on me. I wanted to vanish into the marble floor, to escape the humiliating spotlight. My face burned, my hands trembled, but I forced myself to set the fork down carefully, quietly, as if control over that small gesture could keep me from collapsing inside. Children these days, her father-in-law chuckled, lifting his glass. So refreshingly honest. The table erupted again, the laughter ringing louder than the orchestra. My daughter's smile widened, pride glinting in her eyes. She thought she had scored a victory, impressed the people whose approval she craved. I did not respond. I swallowed the sting, my silence becoming their excuse to laugh louder. They saw my stillness as weakness, my composure as emptiness. None of them realized it was patience. And none of them imagined that the woman they mocked so openly would be the one to bring the room to silence before the night was over. The humiliation cut deep, but it also sharpened something in me. In their laughter, I heard not just cruelty, but opportunity. They had no idea what they had awoken. I slipped away from the table after the laughter died down, retreating toward the edge of the ballroom where the chandeliers cast softer shadows. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, as though the words "fat pig" had lodged themselves in my lungs. I pressed my hand against the cool marble pillar, grounding myself while the orchestra's music covered the sound of my silence. The sting of her words replayed in my mind, not just for their cruelty, but for who they came from. My daughter. The child I had carried in my arms when she was too small to walk. The girl whose shoes I had polished before school, whose homework I stayed up late to check even after 10-hour shifts. The young woman I had believed would someday look at me with gratitude, not contempt. I thought of the nights I skipped meals so she could eat, the winters I wore old coats so she could have new ones, the years I chose work over rest to ensure her future was secure. I remembered how proud she had looked at her graduation, how she had clung to me then, tears in her eyes. Where had that daughter gone? When had I become the enemy of her pride? My reflection caught in the polished glass of a window. The weight she mocked was real. I had never been thin. But what she refused to see was that every curve, every wrinkle, every tired line in my face carried the history of her survival. I was not ashamed of my body. I was ashamed only of the distance it created between us. For a moment, I almost believed them. Maybe I was out of place. Maybe I didn't belong here among glittering jewels and golden watches. But then I remembered. I had built something stronger than appearances. And though they laughed now, the truth I carried was heavier than their laughter could ever be. It was only a matter of time before it came to light. When I returned to the table, I forced my expression into something calm, though inside the humiliation still burned. The laughter had moved on to other topics, but I felt the aftershocks in the way guests glanced at me and then quickly away. My daughter, radiant and confident, leaned toward her father-in-law, who was now in his element. The man spoke as though the party were his personal stage. He launched into stories about his business ventures, each one larger than life. He described properties he had purchased, companies he had invested in, and politicians who owed him favors. His gold watch glinted beneath the chandelier with every emphatic gesture. The guests at the table hung on his words, laughing at his jokes, applauding his cleverness, eager to be seen nodding in agreement. My daughter watched him with admiration, her smile stretched wide as though she wanted nothing more than to prove she belonged to him, to his world. Each time he made a boast, she chimed in with some comment about how lucky she was to have married into such a powerful family. The pride in her eyes was unmistakable, and each time her gaze flicked past me, I felt the sting of her silent comparison. She wanted me smaller, quieter, invisible. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. His pride was a fragile mask. He bragged not because he was secure, but because he needed others to believe he was. Every boast carried the edge of desperation, every laugh forced just slightly too loud. I had seen men like him before, men who measured worth by applause, not by truth. He looked at me as though I were beneath him, but he had no idea who I truly was. Around the table, some guests exchanged glances. They smiled and nodded at his stories, but in their eyes I caught flickers of doubt, the kind that creep in when someone brags too much, too often. My daughter didn't notice. She was too busy basking in reflected glory. I sat silently, hands folded, listening to his boasts about fortunes and power. To him, I was just a prop, the overweight mother-in-law, easy to dismiss. But even as they mocked, even as they flaunted, I knew the balance would not stay tilted forever. His arrogance, my daughter's cruelty, their laughter, it was all leading to a moment they could not see coming. And when it arrived, the same guests who laughed at me would turn their silence on him. The evening stretched on, and with each round of drinks, the father-in-law grew bolder. His voice carried above the orchestra, his laughter booming as if he owned not just the party, but the very air we breathed. My daughter leaned closer to him, glowing with pride, feeding off every word he spoke. She laughed too loudly at his jokes, nodded too eagerly at his boasts, eager to prove her place in his world. Then his eyes fell on me. "And you," he said, tilting his head as if noticing me for the first time. His smile was thin, sharp, the smile of a man preparing to entertain others at someone else's expense. "What do you do, madam? Or is enjoying food your only occupation?" Laughter burst from the table, quick and cutting. My daughter covered her mouth as if to soften her giggle, but her eyes shone with cruel delight. Others leaned forward, eager for my humiliation to continue. To them, I was an easy target, the overweight mother who didn't belong, who would stumble over excuses and shrink under their laughter. I looked at him calmly, folding my hands in my lap. I had endured insults before, and I knew how to swallow pain. But tonight, something inside me had shifted. Their cruelty had cut too deep, their arrogance had soared too high. They had no idea that behind my silence lay something far stronger than their taunts. I held his gaze, unflinching as the laughter rang around me. "I invest," I said softly, my voice steady enough to still a few of their chuckles. Quietly, carefully, in things that last longer than jewels or champagne. The laughter faltered, just slightly. A few heads tilted, curiosity flickering. He smirked, unconvinced, readying another jab. He did not yet realize he had opened the door to the truth that would undo him, and his daughter-in-law with him. The laughter that followed my words was brittle, forced, yet still cutting. The father-in-law leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass, as though I had just told the most amusing joke of the evening. "Invest," he repeated, his smirk widening. "With what? Your pension." A handful of coins saved from groceries. The table erupted once more, their amusement rolling over me like a wave. But I did not flinch. I had spent a lifetime learning when to hold silence and when to let truth speak for itself. Calmly, I reached into my handbag and drew out a slim leather folder. My daughter's laughter faltered when she saw it, though she quickly masked her expression. I placed it on the table in front of the father-in-law and nudged it toward him. "With this," I said quietly. He glanced down at it with mock curiosity before flipping it open. I watched the change in his expression like a storm rolling across the sky. First came indifference, then hesitation, and finally disbelief. His eyes scanned the documents, property deeds spanning continents, stock portfolios worth more than his boasts, accounts that glimmered with numbers he could only dream of. His hand stilled, his smirk died, and for the first time that evening, silence fell over him. The guests, sensing a shift, leaned closer. Whispers rippled across the table. My daughter, her face drained of color, reached for the folder, but her father-in-law pulled it closer, his own hands trembling slightly as he read. This can't be real," he muttered. "It is," I said, my voice low but clear. "While you measured worth in gold watches and champagne, I built quietly. I invested in futures, not facades. And tonight, you mock me because of my body, because of a dress that doesn't shine. But wealth does not glitter, it grows. And it has grown with me." The table was silent. Even the orchestra seemed quieter, as though the music itself had stilled to listen. Every pair of eyes that had once mocked me now burned with shock, curiosity, or shame. My daughter's mouth opened, but no words came. The pride that had lit her face earlier had drained away, leaving only raw humiliation. The father-in-law closed the folder, his hand unsteady. He looked at me with something I had never seen in him before, respect edged with fear. "You," he stammered, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I stood slowly, gathering my bag, letting the silence stretch. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said, my voice steady. "But remember, respect is not given to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who has earned it." I turned to leave, and as I walked away, the whispers behind me grew louder, filling the room like a tide. The chandeliers still sparkled, the music still played, but the balance of the evening had shifted completely. The woman they had mocked, the one they had dismissed as nothing, had become the most powerful figure in the room. And in the silence that followed me out, their empire of arrogance collapsed, not with scandal, but with truth. The moment I left the table, the room did not return to its earlier laughter. It couldn't. The revelation I had dropped into their midst was too heavy, too undeniable. Whispers swelled in the air, rising and falling like a tide. Guests leaned close to one another, eyes darting toward the folder still clutched in the father-in-law's hand, their curiosity gnawing at their composure. I didn't need to look back to know how my daughter sat frozen in her chair. Later, I would hear how her face remained pale, her glass untouched, her smile erased. The same lips that had called me a pig now struggled to form words, every attempt drowned by the shock pressing in on her from all sides. The father-in-law tried to laugh it off at first. He waved a dismissive hand, insisting that wealth on paper was nothing compared to power in action. But his voice cracked in a way it hadn't before, his boast thinner, weaker. The guests caught it immediately. The man who had seemed so invincible minutes earlier now looked smaller, as though my quiet truth had cut the legs out from beneath his throne of arrogance. Relatives shifted uneasily. Some who had laughed loudest at me earlier now avoided my daughter's eyes. A few even murmured words of admiration, directed not at her new family, but at me. Remarkable, one whispered. Imagine hiding such fortune all these years, another said. Respect, once so carefully hoarded by her in-laws, now leaked toward me like a river breaking its banks. The orchestra played on, but the music sounded hollow, out of place in a hall that had lost its sparkle. My daughter excused herself eventually, her head bowed, tears threatening the corners of her eyes. She had wanted this night to prove she belonged among the powerful. Instead, it had proved the opposite, that she had turned her back on the very power that had carried her here. For me, the air outside was cooler, cleaner. The humiliation she had inflicted was gone, replaced by a calm that came only from truth revealed. Inside, the party stumbled on in fractured pieces, but I knew its story had already been rewritten. And at its center was not their wealth or pride. It was me, the woman they had underestimated, the mother they had mocked, the millionaire they never saw coming. In the days that followed, the story of that night traveled faster than the music that had once filled the ballroom. Guests who had witnessed the moment retold it in whispers that spread across social circles, each retelling sharper than the last. The humiliation no longer belonged to me. It clung to my daughter and her in-laws, impossible to wash away. Neighbors who once admired them now looked with curiosity laced with disdain. The father-in-law, who had spent years building his reputation as a man of influence, found his boasts turned against him. Business partners asked subtle questions about how he had been outshone by a woman he had mocked. Old rivals smirked behind polite smiles. His empire of arrogance did not crumble in finances, but in credibility. Respect, once his shield, had slipped through his fingers. My daughter bore the heaviest weight of all. Every friend who had laughed with her that night now remembered her words, how she had called me a pig, how she had smiled at my pain. Their judgment was swift, their pity cutting. Invitations to lunches and galas grew fewer, replaced by uncomfortable silences. She had wanted to rise higher by belittling me, but instead, she had fallen lower than she ever imagined. For me, the justice was not in their shame, but in the truth standing unshaken. I had not raised my voice, had not begged for respect. I had simply let the truth speak when it was needed most. And in that truth, I found peace. The family could no longer look at me the same way. Their laughter had died, replaced by cautious words, softer tones, glances tinged with unease. They had tried to make me small, but they had shown the world who was truly diminished. Justice had not come from revenge, it had come from revelation. And as I watched them wrestle with the consequences, I realized something profound. The greatest punishment for those who trade kindness for cruelty is not what others do to them. It is the mirror they are forced to face when their mask is torn away. Weeks later, when the echo of that night had dulled into memory for most, I walked through the city park at sunset. Children laughed in the distance, their joy untainted by wealth or pride. The sky burned gold, softening into pink, and the breeze carried the scent of autumn. I sat on a bench, resting my hands in my lap, and thought of everything that had passed. I remembered the sting of her words, the sharpness of fat pig spoken so easily, so carelessly. For a time, it had wounded me deeper than I wanted to admit. But wounds, I realized, do not last forever when they are answered by truth. What had seemed like humiliation had become the moment of my greatest clarity. My daughter had not spoken to me much since that night. When she did, her voice trembled with shame, her words tangled with apologies she could not quite form. I did not gloat, nor did I scold. Some lessons do not need more punishment, they need only time. Perhaps one day, she would understand the weight of what she had said, and the strength it had taken for me to endure. As the first stars appeared above, I rose from the bench and made my way home. I walked without hurry, each step steady, each breath unburdened. They had mocked me, tried to strip me of dignity, but I had left the ballroom with more than they could ever give: respect, self-worth, and truth. I was no longer just the mother in the corner, the woman they tried to belittle. I was the reminder that real wealth is not in appearances, but in resilience. And that night, I proved that, even under the harshest light, dignity shines brightest of all.